This is House Planning Help, episode 302. Hi there, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build, because I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up, I've got two guests, Martin and Mhairi Grant, and we're going to be looking at their self-build in Kippen, with particular interest to how well they've done with their money. Quite a bit of sweat equity into this project as well, but it's a cash project, so they didn't really want to borrow any money, which I think is very strong of them. So lots of details to dig into in a moment. My diary has been quite empty over the last year or so. Yeah, that's what happens when a pandemic comes along. But it's lovely to be getting a bit busier. And one of the events in my diary is a presentation that I'm doing as part of the 40th anniversary of Homeworld. So Homeworld was an important housing expo, actually. It was focusing on innovation, and they built all these houses, got different people almost competing against each other, and then sold them for private use. So really interesting. I've been there to Bradwell Common and visited them as well. So this is nice now that they wanted me to focus less on the actual Homeworld, but what has happened since and what would we like to happen. So I thought that'd be a really good title for this. What would Homeworld 2021 showcase? There obviously isn't such a thing, but I thought this gave me license. I'm going to imagine what I would like to see there and what we would be focusing on with all the usual suspects, the climate emergency, resource depletion, overpopulation, pollution, all of these things. And in construction in particular, it'd be lovely to turn a corner and think that every new project was getting these things right of how we can be more ecological with our design. So what I'm going to do is I will put that into the show notes today to the event, and as it goes off into the distance, then you'll be able to look back at the presentation and all of the celebrations that they held there. So that in today's show notes. Right then, let's get to today's featured interview. We do love a case study here. All sorts of interesting things to focus upon. We'll look at land, how they found their plot, also the concept of the house, which is box within a box. I think they've done particularly well with the money. So that's a side I want to know. We could go on endless. We love tips on money here, how we can do more with less. So we are going to probe Mhairi and Martin to find out as much as we possibly can. Let's get underway. I started by asking Mhairi to tell me a little bit about themselves.
So we met at university at the Mackintosh School of Architecture in 1997. I was the year above Martin, so I went there in 96. And then, so we've been friends for a really long time, and then a couple for quite a long time as well now. And then we decided at one point that we wanted to build a new house. So this was the adventure that we decided to go down. And then we decided that we really wanted it to be a passive house. We were living in Glasgow at the time in a flat, which was really, a really beautiful period property, but we had spent about 4 years renovating it. And it was still very cold and kind of, thermally quite uncomfortable, even though it was very beautiful aesthetically. So we were ready for a new challenge, but we didn't want to undo all the work we'd done in that property. So we decided building a new passive house was the next step in our journey.
And the land finding journey, it wasn't that easy. Maybe, Martin, you can tell me a little bit about that.
It would probably took about 2 to 3 years of sort of looking for sites online, going to visit sites, discounting a lot of sites, particularly where we started looking for somewhere around Glasgow and then coming further afield as sort of prices we couldn't meet the sort of figures they were looking for sort of north-facing sites unserviced. And then eventually Mhairi stumbled upon this one online for a site in Kippen. And just kind of coincidentally, I'm kind of from 2 villages along, which wasn't intentional to look for somewhere in this area, but that's just the way it worked out. And we found the plot and we liked it.
How easy is it actually to find pieces of land within your budget? Because you said your budget's about 250,000, haven't you? Is that for everything, or is that just the build cost?
That was just the build cost. So we spent 135,000 on the land, and that was about 20,000 more than we had initially set out to spend. But it was one of those things, as we kept searching, it became clear that the plots that were about 100,000 or so, which had been our initial sort of idea of a budget for a plot, tended to be much more remote than we wanted to live, or tended to be much smaller than we were looking for. Or as Martin said, north facing, they had some other criteria that didn't work for Passive House, for example, or didn't work easily. So we ended up upping our budget for the plot a little bit in order to find something that sort of met our needs better.
And what did you want from a site? Obviously, solar access is one thing, but what were the other criteria?
We wanted to be somewhere semi-rural. We wanted to be in a village or a small town because we wanted to still have daily communication with other people. We didn't want to live in complete isolation, but we also wanted to be somewhere that had the feeling of the countryside because we'd lived in the city for a really long time and we were kind of ready to be somewhere, where we could go for walks and be outdoors a bit more. So somewhere that was big enough to give us a garden as well. I'm really interested in gardening, so that's been really, really enjoyable having a garden for once. And we also wanted something south-facing with a kind of outlook towards the south that we knew wouldn't get built on so that we could control the view a bit more. So that was why we ended up picking this plot, because there's a tree belt to the south and then a kind of open field to the west, which is a designated area of outstanding natural beauty. So very, very unlikely to ever get planning permission to be built on. So that gave us that kind of feeling of the countryside when you're in the house, but still connected to a village.
And what was the process? You mentioned a few different ways of sourcing it, but how did you end up finding this piece?
So this piece of land was actually advertised on an estate agent website. We found the kind of details online and then just came to see it. We did a whole sort of a range of ways of looking, from making contact with local estate agents in a kind of area around an hour outside of Glasgow and telling them we were looking for plots and so on. We actually looked at existing buildings as well, so we didn't rule that out. We looked at barns and dilapidated buildings and so on. We were open to that idea at the beginning, and then we just a lot of Google searching, to be honest, and looking at Google Maps and checking routes and how far away things were and things like that.
Okay, how many sites did you look at on paper and how many did you visit?
Gosh, I would say if we had to put a number on it, we visited probably 20, something around 15 to 20. And I would say that on paper, we looked at least 3 times that. I mean, we looked at a lot of things online and then discounted them for one reason or another before we went to actually see things.
This is the process, though, isn't it? No, it's just interesting to see your take on it. And was it obvious when you got to that site, or was there a bit of discussion between you?
Well, it was interesting because this site is one of 2 that were for sale at the same time. And we actually came to look at the one that's slightly to the north of this one because it was slightly smaller and a bit more affordable, therefore. But when we got here, we saw this one and it goes down a slope and there's a little bit of a burn at the bottom. And we just fell in love with it, to be honest. It just was so picturesque and also had the advantage of being towards the south of the other site. So we knew that someone wouldn't come along and build in front of us, like I say. So we could have this outlook towards our own garden that we knew would be sort of more or less permanent.
Yeah, I think that's something that perhaps if you're not in the industry, you don't think about. You get this lovely open piece of landscape and then you don't have at the back of your mind that it could. It's possible. Some of these places, I've seen it happen multiple times where people have put the housing estate right next door to where you thought it was going to be open forever. So, Martin, then tell us a bit about acquiring the site. Did it have a consent, did you say, to begin with, or was that part of what you needed to do now?
No, it did actually have a consent originally on the plot by the owner. The owner had done a sort of design himself for 2 very traditional houses. They'd been approved by planning. So we had a precedent on the plot of something. So we knew that the something would be allowed to be built. We're just outside of the conservation area. So for us, it was quite a good one in the sense that it had a precedent of an existing building on the approval, but we could maybe tweak it a bit or try and go for something more contemporary and not be within the constraints of the conservation area. Yeah,
that is just such a great freedom that you're given. What is it like there? If you want to build a contemporary house, do you ever have a fight on your hands? Or
I would say we do. Obviously location specific, but we deal with this council Stirling quite a lot. And maybe I suppose when we built or when we did our planning application, 8 years ago now, we were a bit less well known to the planning department, I suppose. So there was a wee bit of resistance in the design, and it's not for everyone a cube, we accept that. But there wasn't planning reasons why our design couldn't be accepted, particularly because it wasn't in the conservation area. And it's also down the back of the main street, so you can't even see it from the road.
Tell us a little bit about the design process then, maybe in relation to the budget. We know that you wanted a passive house, that materials and so forth are important to you, but how are you balancing all of this?
So we knew at the beginning, in order to make this work, we would have to do some of the work ourselves. I mean, I don't think, in all honesty, we anticipated quite how much we would have to do, but that is all part of the journey. And we've learned a lot from doing that, so it's not a regret. We definitely set out to create a simple and clean design that would allow us to easily meet the Passivhaus standard, and we wouldn't then be fighting against that all along. And the other thing we wanted to achieve was sustainability gold in the technical standards in Scotland. So that was another set of criteria to do with water saving and acoustic performance internally and so on that we knew we wanted to meet. So again, we were constantly referring back to these metrics in order to make sure that our design decisions weren't going to make it overly complicated to comply with the standards that we wanted to achieve.
And you've also got a business that you're trying to run. So where is the balance there of, I could be earning money in the office, but I'm on site, or is this weekends? How are you going about the work?
Yeah, that was definitely a challenge. And at the very beginning, Martin took 12 weeks off work to build the timber frame with 2 joiners. So, there was 12 weeks where I was in the office on my own and Martin was on site all day. We've always worked together, just the 2 of us. So I suppose we're quite used to working out these things as we go, because we don't have employees, so we don't have to sort of factor that into the equation or into our decisions.
Did that mean then a drop of income over that? I mean, that's not really a long period of time though, is it? 3 months?
Yeah, it did, yes. I think probably over the whole 6-year period, the most significant thing has been balancing our income with managing to then spend. So that's partly why it's taken so long, so that we can earn money as we go in order to finance the build. But also we have made quite a big sacrifice in terms of social life. I mean, a lot of our free time has been spent building this house. So, I mean, there just have been a lot of weekends when we've not gone to things or not seen people, because we've had to plasterboard or dig up a driveway and put in drainage or whatever it happened to be. So that's part and parcel of a self-build.
So often when I speak to architects, though, you don't ever begrudge that. Was this a good experience, or would you rather have hurried it along?
I think we'd rather have hurried it along, in the sense that 6 years is a long time to build a house. And I think we thought originally it would probably be 2 to 3. But we learned an awful lot. We know quite a lot now about how things go together. Building a Passivhaus isn't as daunting as some people make it out to be. I think it's just a matter of doing things correctly in the correct order and rigorously looking at the detailing. But I don't think we begrudge it now. I mean, I think maybe halfway through you'd say, this is starting to drag on a bit. But I think sort of looking back on retrospectively, I think we've still got fond memories of doing it. I mean, obviously there's bits and pieces you would change if you were to do things again, but nothing dramatic about it we would do differently if we could redo it again.
So how did you keep your energy up? That's the tough point, isn't it? If you're going to do a lot of the work yourself, you need that momentum, and it's not always there, is it? You're going into winters again. So any tips there?
Yeah, that was definitely challenging. And I mean, even taking something like the cladding, for example, we did that over 4 years. So every summer for 4 years, we spent a whole summer cladding and elevation together. And that, after summer number 2, for example, that gets quite wearing. But I suppose all you can do is, remind yourself of what it is you're trying to achieve, and that it'll be worth it in the end. It's like any enormous task. You break it down into smaller tasks, and then you tackle each of those, and then you move forward to the next task and the next task and so on. I don't know. I think working for ourselves, we've learned that as a way to deal with coping with stress at work as well. So that's the technique that we used for the house. And it seemed to kind of get us through it. And of course, I think being in it together did make a difference. We could fully understand what the other was thinking or feeling, because we were going through it at the same time and going through the same thing.
Yeah, a lovely shared process. I'm getting that feeling here. So just rewinding then, did you know how you were going to build this? Once you had this contemporary vision, what it was going to be physically?
Well, we knew we wanted to do timber frame. That was a definite, partly because we think it's a sustainable material to build with, and partly because it's a material we knew we could build with. So that was important. At the time, we struggled a little to find a timber kit company who were either able to offer us a Passivhaus ready solution or willing to adapt their current solution to meet our requirements in terms of view values and so on. So that's why we ended up stick building the frame. So again, kind of decisions like that then lead you to design decisions, I suppose, and vice versa, because the whole thing is interlinked. So for example, at the beginning, we decided we wanted to have a large double height space. And what that meant was a change in the wall construction at the double height area compared to the single height area. So, we had to resolve some technical issues with that with the structural engineer, because we'd made that design decision early on. So yeah, I suppose it's kind of a circular process.
Double height it's a tough one, isn't it, with Passivhaus, because you're rewarded for floor area.
Very, yeah, it's very challenging. Everything once you get into it and you realize everything's ratified against the floor area, you start to feel a little bit kind of well, that's a bit frustrating because I could have had slightly less insulation over here or slightly less work on the window installation detail, for example, in order to have coped with that double height. But for us, because the building is a kind of relatively static shape in that it's a cuboid, the double height really gives some drama, and I think it's very unexpected when you come into the house, which is really nice. I mean, it's still every time I come in, and obviously having designed it and lived with it for many years, it's still a nice, not surprise, that's too strong a word obviously, but it's a nice feeling to come in and experience the double height.
Yeah, I would agree. In our house, admittedly, again, Passivhaus, we perhaps didn't have a huge double height space, but it was something that I really wanted. And you just enjoy that feeling of a bit more space. So maybe you could take us through the build, Martin, I suppose, because you were on site in those early days. So what were you able to achieve in those first 3 months?
The first 3 months, probably, there was quite a lot actually that went on. We obviously, we didn't do the groundworks ourselves. We got somebody to dig out all the foundations, but we installed the Isaquick EPS raft foundation ourselves with some friends over a weekend. So that was quite a good process, getting some friends involved, getting something that kind of appeared quite quickly and quite easily actually, and it was something that we'd certainly do again ourselves. And then we've got somebody to pour the slab, to power float it, and then from there we built the frame. So in the first couple of months the frame went up and we had a sort of building shape and you could experience some of the spaces, albeit with no sheet materials on, so it was kind of an open frame. And I suppose from that point, once the joiners were off site, things sort of slowed down a little bit because obviously it's just Mhairi and I doing sheeting and joinery and various things like that.
Yeah, I mean, doing the insulation, for example, Martin and I did all that together. All the wall insulation was wood fibre bats that were hand cut and hand fitted. And that took us about 4 months, taking as many days off work as we could, and then evenings and weekends.
Yeah, evenings, they are tough. They were the ones that always I struggled with just, I don't know, I don't have the energy to do that. But yeah, respect to you. And then one thing that has really impressed me is, and I don't know how you did this, so who wants to take this, but you didn't take any material really off-site, no skips, no spoil. So how was that achieved? Was it just perfectly flat and you didn't really need to dig down, or, even everything that arrives on site comes packaged in so much stuff. So were you very careful with what did come to site?
Yeah, so in terms of the dig out, we basically just relocated the ground, that got dug out on the site. So we, because the site was quite steeply sloping, after about a third of the length, it drops off quite steeply to the burn. So we basically just moved the ground from one location to another, and therefore created a slightly flatter garden, which is really nice. And then that lets us terrace it down to the burn after that. But it has given us an area to actually have a patio and a deck and things like that. And then in terms of materials and packaging, we were just really diligent. We tried to buy things with as little packaging as possible, obviously. All of the pallets we either used or broke up and were given to my dad for fuel. All the plastic was recycled where it was possible to recycle it. Things like plasterboard, we were just really, really rigorous about not having excess waste and just using up everything we could. And the same with things like the wood fibre insulation. We used offcuts in places like, in the window reveals where we just had a narrow thickness. So we were able to just stack lots of offcuts rather than buying a whole new piece. So yeah, we just paid a lot of attention, I think, to trying to be resourceful and not wasteful.
Do you think that you did invest quite a bit of time? You probably don't notice it, but if it had been going at a faster pace, the project, would you have been able to do the same, or is it trade-off?
Yeah, probably not. I mean, if you imagine stacking a window reveal with tiny strips of wood fibre insulation as opposed to cutting one single sheet and putting it in, obviously even you look at that, you think, okay, say even it was double the time, probably triple the time to do that one job, and you sort of multiply it by the number of windows, you can see the time adding up. But for us, on a tight budget, we can't afford to buy excess amounts of material and then just skip the sort of offcuts. And I think there's a major problem in construction industry where the amount of offcuts of certain materials and wastage is just astronomical. Approximately 40% of plasterboard on site is just put in a skip. I mean, we had, I think, about 4 pieces of plasterboard at about A3 size was our offcuts from the whole build. And I just put them in the car and took them to the tip. But there was no need to sort of get skips sort of based on that kind of level of wastage is what we had.
Yeah, I think you've done really well. So how long was it until you were watertight?
I think looking back, it was probably 6 or 7 months. Slightly longer than would be ideal, and certainly longer than we try and push forward with our clients' projects. But sometimes you just have to be a bit more prepared to cover things and protect them temporarily. So, for example, with the cladding taking that long, we did actually put a temporary breather membrane over the battens in order to just give us a little bit more kind of waterproofing until we got our cladding on. And then each as we went and did each elevation, we could strip that back.
So you sold your flat. Where are you staying at the moment while all this is going on?
So we rented in the village in a couple of different places. We actually sold our flat very quickly, which was a bit of a surprise. So we didn't even have our building warrant approved by the time we moved to Kippen. So we were kind of here a little earlier than we thought we'd be. So we ended up moving a couple of times and rented property. And then we actually stayed in a caravan for 9 months at one point until the building was ready to be camped in.
And at that point, does that then make you think, right, the final push?
Well, definitely. When you're living in a caravan and you're running an electric bar heater permanently to stay dry and warm, and you've got a house sitting next to you which is sort of naturally dry and warm without any heating on or anything, you start to get a bit resentful of where you're staying, and it sort of focuses your mind to move on and try and get in. So I think that was the last straw.
Yeah.
We were living, obviously, in a tiny 2-berth caravan. That was our office, and it was our kitchen and our bathroom, and it was everything simultaneously. And it just, I think 9 months of being in a caravan and water freezing over winter, things like that, it just, it made us realise, okay, it's not finished, the house, but we're going to move into it and sort of get one room prepped that we can sleep in and have our computers in and things, and it's not going to be too dusty, and finish the rest while we're staying in it.
Now, what state were you in when you moved in? What was left to do?
So everything was electrically safe. That was very important to us. We made sure that we had our electrical completion was done, and we were plasterboarded in most of the house. And then we basically, like Martin said, we made sure we had one room that had a kind of relatively dust-free floor covering, but we didn't have a kitchen worktop, for example. So we had a sheet of OSB for a kitchen worktop for about a year, maybe. We didn't have our linoleum flooring upstairs down, so we just had plywood. We didn't have the timber flooring in the halls upstairs down. So again, we just had the kind of acoustic flooring system there.
Where do you put the finish line? Are there still little things that you would like to do in the house, or?
No, I think for us, the house is now considered finished. I think we're happy that it's done, and we're just moving on gradually to doing the landscaping around the house. So we've done this sort of peripheral landscaping last year. We did a patio and got some gravel down and got our deck done last summer. And now we're just moving on to kind of slightly further away from the house into the garden, getting planting sorted, that kind of thing. So,
how have you found the Passivhaus then? You obviously read about it and seen them. What's it been like to live in one?
I mean, honestly, it's amazing. It has exceeded our expectations, I think, in terms of comfort. And we were saying to each other yesterday on our daily walk that actually we've kind of spoiled ourselves because we really wouldn't want to live in anything else now that we've done this. So it's really comfortable. It's really easy to live with as well. I think that's something I really like. There's so little interaction with the tech and things like that for us, it's been really pleasant.
And what about things like overheating? You've got contemporary design where you've got some nice big windows. Obviously, you want this. So were you very careful during the planning stages? And how has that ended up? Has it worked okay?
Yeah, we were very careful when we were designing how much window we had on each elevation, and we were definitely aware at the certification stage, I discussed it with our certifier quite a lot, that we had a higher risk in our master bedroom, which faces west and has a large fixed west-facing window and then a smaller opening window. So we talked a lot about how to kind of mitigate overheating and whether we should have a shading device above that window, for example. And we decided that because we knew we were going to be the end users, we were happy to interact with the building, and we have a roof light above our master ensuite shower, for example. So what we do in summer to avoid overheating is basically open the roof light, open the bedroom window on tilt, and leave the ensuite door open. So we do purge ventilation like that overnight, and that really works. And then we also made sure we had an opening window in both of the upstairs and the downstairs halls so that we could have some cross ventilation during the day, for example, but without having to rely on doors being open. And I think that's really important because I think habitually people do shut their doors, internal doors more frequently than they maybe realise. So it was, it was quite, we definitely had a strategy at the start and we stuck to it, and it has worked.
And have you found this has led on to more Passivhaus projects within the practice?
Yes, definitely. to the point where, which is great, because it's really what we want to work on. And to the point where last year, at the start of 2020, we decided that we would make a commitment to only design our new builds to Passivhaus Classic standard as a minimum. So that's what we're doing from now on. And to be honest, that felt like a bit of a leap, because there's always that worry when you work for yourself in your very small practice, that you make a decision to only do a certain thing, and then if that line of work dries up, you feel you might be stuck. But it's something we just feel so strongly about that we thought that was a worthwhile risk to take, I suppose.
Yeah, I don't think you need to worry too much. It delivers, doesn't it? And you must have that gut feeling as well. You know that's the case. Just going back to some of the other environmental criteria that you've got. You obviously got this lovely timber frame. Is that locally sourced? Is that from Scotland?
It's a little hard to be absolutely certain where the timber came from. And to be honest, at the very beginning of our journey on this house, because it was quite a while ago, we didn't really have a strong feeling about embodied carbon and things like that. So the decisions we made at the beginning were that all the timber had to be FSC, or those were the kind of decisions we made rather than necessarily locally sourced. But we did get it from a local sawmill, so I suspect it is Scottish timber, but I couldn't say that with absolute certainty.
And some of the other elements, I know, water design, efficiency, you said all those things at the beginning, but can you run through some of those?
Yeah, so part of the Sustainability Gold section in the technical standards in Scotland is water saving measures. So we have low flow fixtures and fittings on all of our taps and our showers and so on. And because we have a sedum roof, we've attenuated about 40% of the rainwater from the roof with that. So we only have one rainwater pipe for the whole of the flat roof area. And that then comes down off the building and goes into a catch pit that's filled with stones that we sourced either on the site when we were doing the excavating, or if we had two clients who were doing demolitions of sandstone extensions nearby. So we salvaged quite a lot of sandstone from their projects, and we've used that in our landscaping. So our rainwater goes through this catch pit that's filled with stones and then goes along a trough and goes into a rain garden, which is basically an elevated planter in the garden that has certain types of plants in it that can cope with being either saturated or quite dry. And then there's an overflow from that goes to the burn at the bottom of the garden. So we were quite keen to do this kind of, I suppose it's quite conceptual, but this sort of journey of the rainwater that sort of runs through the garden that you can visually see where the rainwater is going. And
Martin, you've got renewables as well?
That's right. We've got PVs on the roof, not a particularly big array, a 1.5 kilowatt array, but it's enough that in the summer we can run things like a dishwasher, then the washing machine, and it pays for itself at that point. We've also got a solar thermal array, which makes a massive contribution for our hot water needs. It's on the south-facing north side of the parapet, and it massively contributes during the year to the point where we kind of almost get a little bit too much ourselves for just two of us in a 4-bedroom house in the summer. But it's certainly something we would recommend, and we try to. It's one of those things, I think solar thermal is slightly underused in Scotland, and it works even well in sort of overcast days as well. It's definitely been a great choice as part of the house's renewables. We're direct electric here, and we have no combi boiler or no air source heat pump. We just have some infrared panels for the heating.
And where have you put those, in bathrooms and?
No, actually, we've got 3 on ceilings, one in the living room, one in the kitchen, and one in a bedroom, and then we've got another one in the double height space. And we find they're the kind of best places, particularly the double height, because of the slight stratification of the air in that space. It wants to be slightly a position where you put a heating source.
So explain to me again how it works. Because normally you'd think of having something low down. So why are they on the ceiling?
Well, infrared panels work like the sun, where they actually are physical radiators rather than the misnomer of a radiator, which is a convector. So you can put them on the ceiling and it'll radiate heat down onto the surfaces like our concrete slab, and then those themselves release heat. So it's marketed as something, the biggest way they can sort of describe it is to say it's like standing in the sunlight. It's a hard one to describe until you've actually experienced what they're like, but they seem to work quite well in a passive scenario.
And that has worked well in terms of keeping up to temperature. You haven't had any issues there in the depths of winter?
No, they seem to work very well. I mean, in fact, we took part in a little Twitter challenge in February there where we turned off our heating for a week. And the house...
we did, didn't we? So I'd forgotten about that. I should have linked it in earlier. Yes, we both did that.
That's fine. Yeah, exactly. So that was quite interesting because obviously it showed how stable the house was, but also showed that the heating does matter. If you see what I mean, the converse is true, because obviously we did drop a couple of degrees, which is excellent because it's only a couple of degrees over a week is really easy to live with. But also it does show that those IRs are topping up the temperature to keep it at 20.
Did we get lucky with the weather over that week? This is one thing that running it once, I just sort of thinking, I was terrified going into it because I thought, oh, my family will give up. The second they think, oh, it's a little bit cold and it'll probably be 19 degrees, they will start complaining.
Yeah, it was a little mild, wasn't it? But you know, it's still a test, and I think it still did prove something.
Yeah. And certainly, I remember the one specific time was in the office when I was thinking, oh, it's a little bit chilly because it was just approaching the lower part of 19, and the sun came out, and within an hour, I'd topped back up to 20 and a bit. You know, it was lovely. What else should I ask you? Let me just come back because I think you've done so well with this budget. So what would you advise to other people who might be on a tight budget? And I'd like to start with people who are doing the self-build like you are, you know, really getting involved.
So one of the things I did at the start was I basically made a spreadsheet. I quite like spreadsheets, so that was relatively straightforward. And we basically just, every week, I would also take the bank statement and I would be really rigorous about checking what things had cost, you know, against what we predicted they would cost, and then adjusting the things that we could buy after that on the basis of those things. So if, for example, we spent more on screws and plasterboard and so on than I had allowed, that meant we had less in the pot for bathrooms, and we had to maybe be a bit more inventive about materials and choices of fittings and fixtures and so on. I think controlling it is really the only way you can cope with having a really small budget. You have to remain on top of it.
Mhairi, is that your nature, though?
Yes.
Yeah. So you're good, you know, because I can imagine me buying something and then forgetting to write it down or whatever it might be.
Yeah, I'm quite a list-driven person.
Martin, what about you then? Let's say someone who's not actually physically doing the building themselves, they might be looking to hire an architect and a contractor, but what can you do when you haven't got much money to play with?
Well, I think if you're considering doing any kind of self-build, physically doing any work on top of hiring somebody, I think the main thing is to get your wind and watertight shell up and done by somebody else as quickly as possible, because the weather in Scotland, for example, or even Britain, is never going to help with anything sort of dragging out. So I think get to a point where your building's not going to deteriorate from the weather as soon as you can, and then you're sort of free to work in an environment inside of it where you're not affected by the weather and nothing's going to sort of fall apart based on that. And I think that's probably the sort of biggest thing I think we tell our clients who are self-building to various sort of levels and extents. You know, if you've only got a finite amount of money, get that done first, I would say.
Is there anything else you feel we ought to say that could be useful to a self-builder as we round off?
I mean, I think it's like the control aspect. As much research as you can do, you know, as you can afford to do is useful, because, you know, there are a lot of alternatives out there, if you like. So, you know, you don't feel you have to go with the first thing that you come across. So, yeah, research in terms of funding, research in terms of materials and options for construction, and just try and sort of make a sensible decision at every turn, because even the little amounts add up.
Well, Martin and Mhairi, thank you so much for your time. I love just finding out about new houses and the decisions along the way. So thank you very much.
No problem. It's been a pleasure. It's been really nice to talk to you.
Thank you.
Get more in our show notes today, which you can find at houseplanninghelp.com/302 for this episode. We've got our usual summary, which you can go through again, highlighting all the key information. There's some beautiful photos of the house. You know, they were saying about how they were doing one elevation of the house and cladding it each summer. It's paid off. It looks great. So go and have a look at that. If you've got a comment or you'd like to ask a question, well, we're all on social media, or you can do it within the show notes. We'll link to Paper Igloo. That's their architecture firm, where you can find them on Twitter as well. houseplanninghelp.com/302. Let's conclude with a hub update. This is our membership community that we run alongside House Planning Help, aiming to give you more assistance, really, and just prepare you for your build and hold your hand as you're going through the project. There are lots of people in the community as well. You can get their input if you so choose in the forum. We've got courses. We've got office hour calls where you can chat to me. And we've just added a live training with Guy Hargreaves. He's the client on a project that we're going to be using as our next in-depth video case study. It's our first retrofit, and it's a retrofit to Passivhaus standard. But in this particular presentation, we're looking at how the retrofit is going to be performed, what will need to happen, and it's largely the form of the house that's all important in getting to Passivhaus standard. With any renovation project, it's hard. But with this one, the form of the building was so good that actually Passivhaus was not a million miles away. So that's why he decided to go all the way to Passivhaus standard. And he's talking through the work that's happened in the first 3.5 months or so, which a lot of it is just gutting the house. It's amazing to see what happens, because I've never seen this before, but when you strip a building back, there is a lot that comes out, and gradually things are starting to go back in. I'm sure that's going to please Guy because so much has come out. We must be putting some insulation and things in, and that is happening now. And they've got an additional bit of space that they've built onto the back of the house. That part of the building is up to. So all of that in our latest live training. houseplanninghelp.com/join to get more details. Next time, we focus in on project management, and we look at David Arenberg's build. He decided that he was going to do the project management. So how did it all turn out, and can we get any tips from him? The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.